A single mother with $10 left to her name sees a bleeding biker slumped against his Harley in a gas station parking lot. Everyone walks past. She doesn't. She spends her last $10 on bandages and kneels on frozen concrete to save a stranger, not knowing she just emptied her bank account for a man whose brotherhood runs 50 deep. The next morning, the thunder of 50 Harleys shakes her street. But the gift they're carrying isn't just money. It's a secret that connects her 8-year-old daughter to a dead girl, 2 broken brothers, and a music legacy that's been waiting 30 years for this exact moment. Before we get into this one, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever helped a stranger and had it come back to you in a way you never expected? I'd love to hear it. Now let me tell you about Keisha. The Dollar General on Summer Avenue locked its doors at 11, and Keisha Monroe walked out into the cold like she always did, head down, shoulders forward, the wind cutting straight through her Dollar Tree thermal like it wasn't even there. She pulled out her phone and checked her bank app the way she always did at the end of a shift, even though she already knew what it would say. $10.38. She stood still for a moment on the sidewalk, the screen glowing in the dark. That was Zoe's lunch money. 5 days of school, 5 packed bags from the church food pantry, and a juice box she'd squeeze in on Friday if she could manage it. She put the phone away and got into the Corolla. The car complained the whole way down Lamar Avenue. A knock in the engine she'd been ignoring for 3 weeks, and the front left tire, she'd known for days it was dangerously low, but the gas station air pump was $1, and she'd needed that dollar for other things. Tonight, she had no more excuses. She pulled into the BP on the corner, killed the engine, and stepped back out into the cold. That's when she saw him. He was massive, 6'3" at least, maybe 240, slumped against a Harley-Davidson near the far pump like a wall that had decided to fall. The leather cut across his back said what he was before you could read a single word. Hell's Angels. Patches layered on patches. A gray beard, skin mapped with old tattoos, and a gash on his right forearm that was bleeding through a gas station paper towel he'd pressed against it. 2 customers walked past him without looking. A man filling up his truck glanced over, then glanced away. The clerk had propped open the door and was watching from a distance. "Ma'am," he called to Keisha. "I'd just leave that alone." Keisha looked at the man against the motorcycle. She looked at the way his hands were shaking, at the glassy look in his eyes. She knew that look. She saw it in her patience. She turned and went into the store. 4 minutes later, she came back out with gauze, antiseptic wipes, a bottle of water, and a peanut butter granola bar. The receipt in her pocket said $9.87. Her bank account now held 51 cents. She knelt on the frozen concrete beside him. "I'm going to clean that up," she said, keeping her voice the same way she kept it with Mr. Gaines, gentle but sure. "Can you tell me if you're diabetic?" He looked at her like she was something he couldn't explain. "You don't know what I am," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting. "I know what you need," she said, and opened the gauze. He let her. She worked quietly, cleaning the gash, pressing the bandage firm. She opened the granola bar and set it on his knee without asking. She unscrewed the water bottle and placed it in his hand. He ate without a word, and after a few minutes the shaking slowed. Color came back into his face. From the back seat of the Corolla, a sound rose through the cracked window. A child's voice. Humming. Not a nursery rhyme, something else. Something shaped and whole, with intervals too precise for an 8-year-old who'd never been taught to hum that way. The big man's head turned. He listened, and something happened to his face that had nothing to do with the insulin or the cold. Something behind his eyes broke open, just slightly, like a seam giving way under pressure that had built for years. "What's her name?" he asked. "Zoe," Keisha said. She stood, gathered her wrappers, and looked down at him. "There's a 24-hour clinic on Poplar if that arm needs stitches. You shouldn't ride tonight." She got in the car. She backed out of the lot. She turned onto Lamar Avenue, and the taillights of her 2009 Corolla disappeared into the January dark. The man she'd left behind sat against his Harley for a long moment. Then, with a shaking hand, he reached into his coat and pulled out a gas receipt and a pen. He pressed the paper against his knee and wrote down her license plate number before he forgot it. He didn't know why exactly. He just knew he couldn't let this be the end of it. He took the long way back. Iron Kendrick didn't ride fast on nights like this. Not because of the arm, though the arm still throbbed under the bandage that woman had wrapped so carefully, but because on January 14th he never rode fast. He always took the long way back from Memorial Park. Always gave himself time to let the grief sit before he had to go back inside and be Iron again. Lily had been 9 years old, leukemia, 22 years ago, and he still knew the exact weight of her, 47 pounds at the end, because he'd carried her more often than the hospital bed in those final weeks. He'd carried her to the window so she could watch the birds. He'd carried her to the piano in the common room and held her upright while she played what she could still play. He had a friendship bracelet on his left wrist that she'd made him from a kit a church volunteer brought to the ward, and he hadn't removed it in 22 years, not once. He pulled into the clubhouse lot on Summer Avenue and sat on the bike for a moment before going in. Duke was at the bar, nursing a beer, waiting the way Duke always waited, without seeming to. He was 54, built like a retired linebacker, with a gray beard and reading glasses he refused to admit he needed pushed up on his forehead. He looked at Iron's bandaged arm and didn't say anything. "Gas station on Lamar," Iron said, settling onto the stool beside him. "Diabetic episode. I skipped my insulin." "I know." A woman stopped. Duke turned slightly. "What kind of woman?" Iron thought about how to answer that. He thought about the kneeling, the way she hadn't hesitated, hadn't weighed the leather cut or the patches or the wide berth everyone else was giving. She just knelt on frozen concrete like it was the most natural thing in the world, and worked. "The kind that had $10 and spent all of it," he said. Duke was quiet for a moment. "You want to send something?" "She wouldn't take it. I know because I went back in the morning." He had used the plate number to find out which station she refueled at. It wasn't hard. And he'd ridden back at 7 a.m. and found her there, crouched at the front left tire with a dollar coin air pump, her shoulders doing that forward lean like she was bracing against something invisible. He'd walked over. She'd looked up at him with those calm brown eyes, and he'd held out $300 cash, and she'd shaken her head and said, "I didn't do it for money. You needed help." And then she'd stood up, checked the tire pressure with a gauge she kept in her glove box, and gone to work. Iron set his beer down. "My daughter died and nobody knelt on the concrete for me," he said. "This woman had $10 to her name and she knelt." Duke didn't offer anything. He knew better. "She had a church sticker on her car," Iron said. "St. Andrew's on South Parkway. Her little girl takes piano lessons there." He had seen the flyer stuck in the corner of the rear window, faded, months old, a recital announcement. "Miss Ida Briggs, piano instruction. I need to understand her life before I do anything. I want to talk to whoever knows her there." Duke studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Iron finished his beer and went to bed. He lay in the dark a long time, listening to the silence where his daughter's humming used to live. And he thought about a sound rising from the back seat of a battered Corolla. Perfect pitch. The kind that only comes once. He thought about his brother Clarence. He hadn't said the name out loud in 30 years. He wasn't going to say it now. But he thought it. Monday morning, Keisha packed Zoe's lunch at the kitchen counter. A peanut butter sandwich, an apple, 2 crackers from the pantry box, and a napkin on which she drew a small heart the way she did every day. Zoe came out of the bedroom in her coat, already wearing her backpack. "Why's there no juice box?" Zoe asked. "I forgot it on the counter," Keisha said. She kept her voice easy. "I'll put 2 in tomorrow." Zoe looked at her for 1 second with those wide-set eyes that were entirely her father's. Then she nodded and picked up her backpack straps with both hands. She never pushed. She never pressed. At 8 years old, Zoe Monroe had already learned the shape of things she wasn't supposed to know. Keisha watched her walk toward the car and felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Then she put on her coat and followed. Her first shift was across town in Whitehaven, 3 patients back-to-back, home visits. She checked blood pressure, administered medication, changed bandages, and made Mr. Gaines laugh twice before 10 a.m. He was 89, small and papery-skinned, and he called her "my girl" in a voice that was mostly air now. She'd been his aide for 2 years. She knew which chair he liked. She knew he needed the blinds tilted at exactly the angle where the light hit the cardinal feeder outside his window, and she tilted them without being asked. Then his daughter, Patricia, pulled her aside in the hallway. "The agency is transferring him," Patricia said. Her voice was careful, the way people's voices get when they've rehearsed hard news. "A facility in Collierville, the one with the memory care unit. They think it's time." Keisha kept her face still. "It's 45 minutes, she said. "I know. The bus doesn't reach out there." "I know, Keisha." "The facility had visiting hours that ended at 6 p.m., Patricia explained. After 6, they turned visitors away at the door. She was sorry. She knew what Mr. Gaines meant to Keisha. Keisha went back in and said goodbye to him with a smile he could see. He told her to come see him when they moved him. She promised she would. She drove to the BioLife Center on her break between jobs. She sat in the chair, extended her left arm, and waited for the needle. The $50 would go directly to Miss Ida. The $15 for this month's lesson, the rest banked against next month. She had a small notebook in her purse where she tracked it. Zoe's piano fund, written at the top in her careful handwriting, amounts recorded in a column below. She was still thinking about Mr. Gaines when she drove back. 45 minutes from the city. No bus. 6 o'clock cutoff. She'd figure it out. She always figured it out. What she didn't know was that across town, at St. Andrew's Baptist Church on South Parkway, a massive man in a Hell's Angels cut had walked through the side door and was standing in the nave, listening to a woman play hymns on an old upright organ as if he'd stepped through a door into a different world. Miss Ida finished her chord and turned on the bench without hurry. She looked at Iron the way she looked at everything, clear-eyed and unimpressed by surface. Her reading glasses hung on their beaded chain. Her arthritic hands rested in her lap. "You're the man from the gas station," she said. Not a question. He nodded. "Sit down, then." He told her what had happened. He told her the whole thing, the anniversary, the collapse, the kneeling woman, the granola bar, the humming from the back seat. Miss Ida listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know I'm here," he said. "I want to understand her situation before I do anything. I don't want to embarrass her." Miss Ida studied him. She looked at his eyes when he talked about the little girl humming. She looked at the friendship bracelet on his left wrist. She reached some private conclusion. "Keisha Monroe," she said, "donates plasma twice a week to pay for Zoe's piano lessons. She hasn't missed a single month's payment in 2 years, not even when she was down to eating crackers for dinner." Iron didn't move. "She has $74,000 in medical debt from her husband. Collectors call the house. She takes the calls in the kitchen with the door closed so Zoe can't hear." Miss Ida folded her hands. "And 2 months ago, she sold her wedding ring to buy Zoe's school supplies. She told that child she took it to be cleaned." The church was very quiet. "She's working 2 jobs, raising that little girl alone, and she's been doing it since Marcus died," Miss Ida said. "She gives what she doesn't have." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Somebody needs to catch her before she falls." Iron walked out into the gray January afternoon with the weight of that sentence pressing down on his shoulders. He sat on his bike a long time before he started it. He didn't know yet about the envelope waiting under Keisha's door, the one with Ray Tillman's name and address printed at the top, and a new rent figure inside that would make the math she'd been doing every night impossible. He would know soon enough. The notice was on the kitchen table when she got home from her morning shift. She'd found it slipped under the door, Ray Tillman's name and address printed in clean block letters at the top, like it was a business correspondence and not a grenade. Rent increase: $785 to $950, effective in 30 days. She already owed $200. From the next room came the sound of Zoe practicing scales on the second-hand keyboard, the one with 3 broken keys taped over with masking tape so the sticky action didn't throw her off. Up and down, steady and patient. Zoe never complained about the broken keys. Keisha folded the notice and put it in her purse. Tillman's property office was on Elvis Presley Boulevard, a rented storefront with a fake potted tree by the door and motivational posters on the walls. He was a soft, pink-faced man in a sweated-through dress shirt, and when Keisha sat down across from him, he adjusted his watch, a thick Rolex, with the practiced motion of a man who liked to remind you what he owned. She presented her case simply: 3 years of on-time payments, a 2-year streak with no complaints filed against her, a job loss, a death, and a gap she'd been slowly closing. She wasn't asking for charity, she was asking for time. Tillman listened with the particular patience of a man who has already decided. "This building is going in a new direction," he said. He had the smile of a man who found courtesy easier than honesty. "I can offer you $500 to vacate voluntarily by the end of the month. That's a generous offer, and I'd encourage you to take it seriously." Keisha looked at him steadily. "I've requested hot water repairs 3 times in 5 months. The building is under renovation," he said. "That's exactly why we need flexibility. Sentiment doesn't pay the rent, sweetheart." The word landed. He'd meant it to. "Neither does a building with no hot water, Mr. Tillman," she said quietly. She drove home with the grinding in the engine louder than it had ever been. She pulled into the apartment lot and sat with her hands on the wheel, doing the math one more time. $950, minus what she had, minus what she owed. The numbers spread in front of her like a field with no path across it. Then she got out of the car. She walked around to the passenger door, picked up Zoe's backpack, and carried it on her own shoulder the 4 blocks to Miss Ida's church for the piano lesson. The cold cut into her face. She kept her chin up. She didn't tell Miss Ida about Tillman. She didn't need to. Miss Ida watched her set the backpack down and straighten herself, and she read everything that needed reading. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Keisha sat alone at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her eyes closed. She wasn't sure if it was prayer exactly, more like an appeal to something she believed was listening. Miss Ida called Iron the next morning. She didn't say much. She just told him the walls were closing in and told him the figure on the notice. Iron said he understood. He said he needed a few more days. He was already planning. But before he acted, he needed to know the whole picture. He'd asked Miss Ida for another meeting. She'd said Wednesday. She'd brought a notebook. That was the first thing Iron noticed when he sat down across from Miss Ida in the church fellowship hall. A small spiral notebook, the kind from a dollar store, its pages filled in her meticulous handwriting. Dates, amounts, small details. She hadn't kept it for leverage or proof. She'd kept it because she loved Keisha Monroe and couldn't carry the weight of watching alone. "Start wherever makes sense," Iron said. Miss Ida opened the notebook. She told him about the Plasma Center, BioLife on Lamar Avenue. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times if they'd allow it. $50 a session, going directly into Zoe's piano fund. She'd been doing it for 18 months without missing more than a handful of appointments. "She comes to lessons sometimes with a bandage on her arm," Miss Ida said, "and she rolls her sleeve down before Zoe can see." She told him about the $74,000 in medical debt, about the collectors who called the house every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, and how Keisha had started timing her calls with the agency so she was always driving when they rang. She told him about the wedding ring, a plain gold band Keisha had worn for 10 years, sold at a pawn shop on Union Avenue to cover school supplies in September. Zoe had asked about it once. Keisha had said she took it to be cleaned. She'd said it with a smile that didn't wobble. Iron sat with his hands flat on the table. "Her daughter," he said. Her gift. How real is it? Miss Ida's expression changed. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She found the recording and pressed play and set it on the table between them. A child's voice filled the little room, clear and true and unself-conscious, the way only very young singers are, not performing, just being. The melody moved through the air like it belonged there. Iron went very still. When it ended, he didn't speak for a moment. His jaw was tight. He was looking at something that wasn't in the room. "What is it?" Miss Ida asked. He told her. Haltingly, in the way men tell things they've kept sealed for decades, the words coming out rough at the edges, like something broken being brought back through a narrow door. A daughter named Lily. A gift just like that, maybe better, maybe the same. Leukemia at age 9, 22 years ago. A brother who didn't come home. Miss Ida reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her arthritic fingers were warm. She didn't say anything, which was exactly right. After a while, she told him the last thing. About Collierville. About Mr. Gaines. About Keisha driving 45 minutes on bald tires on her days off to visit an old man who called her "my girl," arriving unpaid, unbilled, unrecognized. About the nights she couldn't make the 6 o'clock cutoff and stood on the grass outside his first-floor window and sang to him through the glass. Iron looked up. "She sings to him through the window." "His daughter called the church to tell me," Miss Ida said. "She didn't know who else to call." She closed the notebook. "Keisha doesn't know how to stop giving. That's her gift, and that's what's going to break her." Iron drove back to Summer Avenue with both hands on the handlebars and the January wind in his face and the sound of that child's voice still echoing somewhere behind his sternum. He knew what he had to do. He'd known since the gas station. He just needed to be sure he could do it right. Saturday night, he would call the chapter together. But first, things were going to get worse. The Corolla died on Thursday night. She'd pulled into the Dollar General lot after her morning shift, meaning to check the tire pressure before her afternoon rounds, and when she turned the ignition back on, there was a sound like something essential coming apart under the hood, and then silence. Complete silence. The dashboard lights blinked once and gave up. The mechanic at the BP garage said $1,800 minimum. He said it gently, which almost made it worse. Keisha nodded, thanked him, and walked 3 blocks to the bus stop. She stood in the cold with her hands in her coat pockets and waited. Without the car, Collierville was impossible. She called the facility from the bus and asked them to tell Mr. Gaines she'd been delayed, that she'd be back soon. Her voice stayed even until she hung up. Then, she looked out the bus window at nothing in particular and let it be what it was. She was written up at Dollar General the following night. The bus ran late, and she arrived 17 minutes past her shift start. Her supervisor, a tired young man named Doug, handed her the form with an apology in his eyes. "One more and I have to take it upstairs," he said. She signed it. She didn't argue. Then Tillman filed the eviction. She got the notice in the hallway, sliding out of the mail slot just as she was coming in from her day shift, in front of Mrs. Coleman, who was checking her own mail and saw Keisha open it. Mrs. Coleman looked at the form and then looked away fast, down at her slippers, the way people look away from accidents. Keisha knew why. Tillman was doing the same thing to her. Solidarity felt dangerous when you were barely holding your own footing. 14 days to respond or vacate. Keisha folded the paper into her coat pocket, went inside, and started making dinner. She held it together through homework and bath time and the reading of 2 chapters of a library book. She held it together through Zoe's prayers and the tuck-in and the hall light left on just slightly. She held it until she was sitting alone at the kitchen table with the eviction notice and the car repair estimate and the rent increase side by side in front of her, and then she put her face in her hands. She was still like that when Zoe padded out in her socks and light-up sneakers that no longer lit up. Marcus's sneakers, the last pair he ever bought her. Zoe didn't say anything at first. She just climbed into her mother's lap the way she used to when she was smaller, which she barely was anymore, and wound her arms around Keisha's neck. "I'm almost done with your surprise," she whispered. "Daddy said music fixes everything." A pause. "I'm almost done fixing it, Mama." Keisha held her tight. For a long moment, she just held on. She didn't ask what the surprise was. She didn't need to. She could feel, in the warmth of her daughter's small body, that whatever it was real, and it was made entirely from love. Friday morning, she put on her scrubs and went to work. That Saturday night, 50 men gathered around a scarred wooden table on Summer Avenue, and Iron Kendrick stood up to talk. The clubhouse on Summer Avenue smelled like motor oil and old wood, and on Saturday night it was full. 50 men around a table that had seen 30 years of chapter business, arguments, losses, celebrations, debts collected and paid. Iron stood at the head of it, and for a moment he just looked at them. Then he told them about Keisha Monroe. He started at the gas station. He told it plain: the $10, the gauze, the frozen concrete, the granola bar placed on his knee without a word. He told them she'd refused his cash the next morning, calm as a woman who had all the time in the world, and said 4 words: "I didn't do it for money." He told them about Miss Ida's notebook, the plasma center twice a week, the $15 piano lessons never missed, not once, not even when she was eating crackers for dinner. He told them about the wedding ring, and the lie she told her daughter, and the child who believed her. Duke read off the numbers. Medical debt, $74,000. Eviction timeline, 14 days and counting. Car, dead in a parking lot. Dollar General write-up, 1 more away from termination. The room was quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind, the listening kind. Iron set his phone on the table. He pressed play on Miss Ida's recording. Zoe's voice filled the clubhouse, clear and whole and unself-conscious, and 50 men who had seen things that would stop most people cold sat still and said nothing. When it ended, Iron laid out the plan. Rent arrears cleared and 6 months prepaid, $7,200 total. A pooled fund to attack the medical debt. Hatch would tow the Corolla and rebuild it from the axles up. And there was one more piece, the one that made the room shift. He told them about his brother Clarence, about Riverside Sound Studios, about the Stax Music Academy and what it could mean for a girl with that voice. He watched the faces around the table register what he was asking, because they all knew. Everyone at that table knew about Iron and Clarence. Grit leaned forward. He was 67, with silver rings on every finger and a face like cracked leather, and he said what he'd always said when money was on the table. "We're not a charity." Iron looked at him for a long moment. "She gave everything she had to a stranger who looked like the last man on earth anyone would help," he said. "If that's not what this cut is supposed to mean, take mine." Grit was quiet. The vote passed unanimously. After, Iron stepped outside into the cold alone. He stood under the parking lot light for a while. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't dialed in 30 years. It rang twice. A voice, older, careful, said, "William?" Not Iron, William. The old wound opened immediately. They circled each other through the phone, 2 men carrying 30 years of silence like weather. Then Iron said Lily's name, and Clarence went quiet. Iron said, "I have a recording. I'm going to send it to you." He hung up and sent the file. Then he went back inside and left Clarence to listen alone. Monday morning, Keisha Monroe walked into a courthouse by herself. She'd borrowed Mrs. Coleman's iron the night before to press her blouse, a deep burgundy button-down she'd worn to Marcus's memorial service and hadn't touched since. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the early morning and made sure everything was straight. Then she put on her nursing sneakers, the white ones scrubbed clean every Sunday night, the ones with the cracked soles she'd been meaning to replace for 8 months. She walked into the Shelby County Tenant Court at 8:45 with a manila folder under her arm. Tillman arrived at 9 with a lawyer in a wool coat. The lawyer set a leather portfolio on the table and didn't look at Keisha once. When Tillman's attorney spoke, the case sounded simple. $200 short, chronic payment issues, a pattern of delinquency. He asked for immediate eviction. He said it the way people say things they've said 100 times before. Then Keisha stood up. She didn't have a lawyer. She had the folder. She opened it and laid her ledger on the table. A composition notebook filled in her handwriting, every rent payment for 3 years recorded with dates and amounts. Every repair request she'd submitted, also dated. The hot water, twice. The mold in the second bathroom, 3 times. The broken stair on the second-floor landing that a city inspector would later photograph. She read the list aloud in a voice that didn't waver. She read it like a woman who had spent the weekend making sure every word was true. "I fell $200 short 6 weeks ago," she said. "Before that, I was never late. I am not asking for pity, Your Honor. I am asking for the time I've earned." Judge Patrice Webb looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. She was 61, unhurried, with a small gold scale of justice pin on her collar. She asked 2 questions, about the hot water complaint and the date of the stair repair request, and wrote something down. She granted a 30-day continuance, pending investigation of the code violation claims. Tillman's jaw tightened. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. What Tillman didn't know, what Keisha didn't know either, was that in the back of the courtroom, 3 people in dark jackets had been sitting quietly since the doors opened. Iron, Duke, and Sal, with a phone that held photographs. 14 of them, taken over 2 weeks across 3 buildings. They hadn't filed anything yet. They were waiting for exactly this, 30 days, and a judge who had already noticed the pattern. Keisha walked out into a bright January morning, folder clutched against her chest, legs unsteady. She stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. She didn't see the man watching from across the street. She didn't see the way Iron exhaled when she walked out still standing. She didn't know that tomorrow morning her street was going to sound like thunder. She was spreading peanut butter on Zoe's sandwich when she heard it. A low rumble at first, distant, then building, the kind of sound that made the windows tremble in their frames. Keisha put down the knife and looked out the kitchen window. 50 Harley Davidsons were turning onto her street in formation, not scattered, not drifting in from different directions. Formation. 2 columns, steady and deliberate, the roar of them rolling through the neighborhood like something that had been planned. Neighbors were already stepping onto porches. Mrs. Coleman stood in her doorway in her house slippers, one hand over her mouth. The bikes parked in a long line at the curb. The biggest man Keisha had ever seen swung off the front bike and walked toward her door. She opened it before he could knock. "You probably don't remember me," he said. She looked at him. The gray beard, the cut, the arm. "The gas station," she said. "Your arm." He nodded. "My name is William Kendrick. People call me Iron. I need you to let me show you something." She stepped outside. The bikers had formed a wide semicircle on the sidewalk, quiet and still. Iron reached into his cut and produced 3 envelopes. He handed her the first. Inside, a money order made out to Ray Tillman. Rent arrears cleared. 6 months prepaid. $7,200. Keisha looked up. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. The second envelope held $28,000, pooled from the chapter over 2 weeks, for Marcus's medical debt, collected 500 at a time, 50 at a time, from 50 men who'd given what they had. The third wasn't an envelope. It was a key. Iron pointed to the curb. Her Corolla sat there gleaming, resting on 4 brand-new tires. Hatch had rebuilt it over the weekend. It ran better than it had in 3 years. "I can't," Keisha started. Sal stepped forward, compact, weathered, in a leather cut with a sergeant-at-arms patch. Her voice was steady. "We know about the plasma center," she said. "We know about the piano lessons. We know about Mr. Gaines and the window." She looked at Keisha without blinking. "You sang to an old man through glass in the freezing cold because you couldn't get through the door? We're just making sure every door opens for you now." Keisha pressed her lips together hard. She was not going to cry in front of 50 bikers. She failed. Iron waited until she steadied, then he said quietly, "There's one more thing, but it needs a phone call." He pulled out his phone and dialed, and put it on speaker and held it between them. A voice came through, older, unhurried, with a Memphis accent that deepened when it was carrying something heavy. "My name is Clarence Kendrick," the voice said. "I believe you know my brother." Clarence Kendrick's voice came through the phone like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. He told Keisha he'd listened to a recording of Zoe singing at a church recital. Then he'd listened to a second one. Miss Ida had sent it separately, of Zoe playing piano and humming a melody she'd composed herself. He'd listened to both recordings more than once. "I run something called the Kendrick Music Foundation," he said. "We've been working with Memphis music education for 20 years. I produced records at Riverside Sound Studios in the 70s. Al Green, Isaac Hayes recorded on those same boards. The studio is restored now." He paused. "I want to offer your daughter a full scholarship to the Stax Music Academy. Tuition, instruments, summer intensives, fully funded through high school." Keisha's hand went to her mouth. Around her, the bikers stood perfectly still. "There's something else," Clarence said. His voice dropped. "The scholarship has a name. It's called the Lily Kendrick Memorial Scholarship." A long beat. "Lily was my brother's daughter. She died at age 9. She had a gift like your daughter's, and I wasn't there when she needed me." He stopped, started again. "I've been holding this scholarship for years, waiting for the right story. I never found one, until William called me." On the sidewalk beside Keisha, Iron's jaw was working. His eyes were fixed on something above the rooftops. The friendship bracelet on his left wrist, the one Lily had made him, the one he'd never taken off, caught the winter light. "I should have named something after her a long time ago," Clarence said, his voice cracking wide open. "I should have come home." Iron put his hand over his face. The two brothers hadn't spoken in 30 years, and this phone call was doing what 30 years of silence never could. It was breaking the wall down, one word at a time. Keisha looked at this massive, weathered man standing next to her, with his face in his hand, and understood, fully, what she was inside of. This wasn't just about Zoe. This had never been only about Zoe. "There's also a demo session," Clarence added, steadying himself, "at Riverside, whenever she's ready." From the doorway behind Keisha, a small voice said, "Mama?" Zoe was standing at the door in her socks, her two puffs slightly unraveled from sleep. She'd been there long enough to have heard most of it. She looked at her mother, and then at Iron, and then at the phone. "Can I play my song?" she asked quietly. "The one I made you?" Keisha nodded, not trusting her voice. The bikers heard. The neighbors heard. Everyone on that sidewalk heard. But nobody yet knew what the song was about. Nobody yet knew what Zoe had been building in secret on the church piano, note by note, for weeks. They would find out. But first, Keisha looked at the people gathered around her and thought about the woman 2 doors down who had looked away in the hallway. The woman who was also being squeezed out. The woman who had finally, quietly, been brave enough to sign her name to a statement. "Mrs. Coleman," Keisha said, "and the other tenants he's pushing out." She looked at Iron. "If you're helping me, help them too." Iron turned to Duke. Duke nodded. One piece of business remained. Ray Tillman was reviewing lease termination paperwork when the door opened. He looked up expecting his office manager. What he got was Iron Kendrick filling the doorframe, Duke 2 steps behind him, and Sal coming in last, carrying a folder so thick it made a sound when she set it on his desk. Tillman leaned back in his chair and touched his Rolex. "This is private property," he said. "I'll call the police." "Go ahead," Iron said. He sat down across from Tillman without being invited. "The filings are already public record." Sal opened the folder. 14 documented housing code violations across 3 of Tillman's South Memphis buildings. Photographs, broken fire escapes, disconnected smoke alarms, a hallway with exposed wiring, dates going back 11 months, signed tenant statements, including one from a woman named Coleman in Building 2. Everything already submitted to the Memphis Division of Housing Code Enforcement, already timestamped, already logged. Tillman's eyes moved across the pages fast. "Here's what matters," Sal said, her voice flat and precise. "The filing references your prior warning, the one from 18 months ago at your Prospect Avenue property, the one you ignored." She tapped the page. "That makes this a second offense. That triggers mandatory emergency inspection of all 40 properties." The color left Tillman's face. He reached for his phone and dialed his lawyer. Iron and Duke waited. Sal closed the folder. The call lasted 4 minutes. Tillman said very little. His lawyer said quite a lot. When it was over, Tillman set the phone down on the desk instead of into the cradle, as if he'd forgotten how it worked. Iron stood up. "A pro bono attorney filed a retaliatory eviction motion this morning," he said. "Duke's cousin works at Memphis Area Legal Services. Judge Webb will see it by end of week." He looked at Tillman without heat, without satisfaction, just the plain weight of it. "You tried to take her home over $200. She gave her last 10 to a stranger. That's the difference between you and her, and now everybody's going to know it." Tillman said nothing. They left him sitting there. 3 days later, Judge Patrice Webb formally dismissed Keisha Monroe's eviction case with a written note citing the landlord's pattern of retaliatory filings and unresolved code violations. The dismissal was 2 paragraphs. Clean. Final. Keisha read it at the kitchen table and set it down and sat quietly for a long moment. Then she got up and started packing. 5 weeks later, Zoe Monroe had her own room for the first time in her life. It was a Tuesday in late February, a clear, cold morning in Cooper Young, and the 2-bedroom apartment on Evelyn Avenue was flooded with light from east-facing windows. Clarence's foundation had covered the first year's subsidized rent through a program his nonprofit ran for families in transition. The walls were painted a clean off-white. There was a closet with a door that closed all the way. And against the far wall of Zoe's room, donated by Miss Ida when she retired from teaching, though she swore she'd never retire from playing, stood a real upright piano. Zoe walked up to it slowly. She pressed one key, then she sat down and began to play, softly, the melody she'd been building for weeks. And Keisha stood in the doorway and listened, and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Safe. At work the following week, Keisha's supervisor called her into the office. She'd received a letter. It was from a woman named Patricia, Mr. Gaines's daughter, addressed to the agency director. It said that Keisha Monroe was the best person Patricia had ever met, that she had driven 45 minutes unpaid on her days off to sit with a dying man, and that when she couldn't get through the door, she had stood outside his window in the cold and sung to him. The letter asked that this be known, that it not go unseen. Keisha was promoted to lead home health aide that afternoon. She visited Mr. Gaines every Saturday now, on schedule, in the daylight. Across town, in Midtown, Iron Kendrick walked into Riverside Sound Studios for the first time in 30 years and found his brother waiting. Clarence was thinner than Iron remembered, older. They stood in the entryway and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Clarence said, "Come in," and Iron followed him down the hall. They sat in the small room where Lily had once sung into a toy microphone as a toddler, before any of it, before the illness, before the rift, before 3 decades of silence. The gold records on the wall, the faint smell of old tape and polished wood. They sat in that room and they grieved, together, for the first time. "I built all of this," Clarence said quietly, looking around at the records, the studio glass, the legacy of it. "And the only thing worth anything is the part I'm giving away." Iron nodded. His eyes were wet. Outside, 3 of Tillman's buildings were under formal city inspection. Mrs. Coleman had already been connected to relocation assistance. The inspector photographed a broken fire escape while Tillman watched from the sidewalk below, small in his pressed shirt, the Rolex on his wrist catching the light. Inside the studio, 2 brothers began to plan something bigger than either of them, something that would carry Lily's name into the future and make sure that the next woman drowning alone in a double shift had somewhere to turn. They had work to do. April in Memphis is something to witness. The dogwoods come in early and the air turns soft, and on the Saturday of the inaugural Lily Kendrick Memorial Charity Ride, the sky over the Stax Museum of American Soul Music was the kind of blue that makes a person feel like the world has been cleaned. 50 Harleys rode from Riverside Sound Studios on Macklemore Avenue to the museum parking lot. The same route, the same formation as the morning they had turned onto Keisha's Street in January. Donors lined the route. Pledges came in by phone and text and handshake. By the time the bikes rolled to a stop in front of the museum, the inaugural ride had raised $43,000 in a single day. Clarence stood at the doors to greet them, elegant in a blazer over an open collar, his long musician's hands moving the way they always moved, as if conducting something invisible and very much alive. Inside, Keisha Monroe walked to a podium. She didn't talk about herself. She hadn't planned to, and she didn't. She talked about Marcus, about a man who stocked shelves in a warehouse and never complained about his body failing him, who told his daughter that music fixes everything, who believed with his whole quiet heart that you can't outgive God. She talked about what it means to be one flat tire away from losing everything. Not one bad decision, not one moral failure, just one flat tire. And about all the people carrying that weight right now, invisibly, in cities nobody's making documentaries about, packing lunches from food pantries and pretending everything is fine. The crowd in the museum courtyard was still. Marcus used to say, "You can't outgive God," Keisha said. She looked out at the crowd, at Iron in the front row, at Miss Ida's clasped hands. "I think he was right," she paused. "But I also think God sends bikers sometimes." Laughter moved through the crowd, warm and releasing. Then Iron stood up. He was not a man built for podiums, and everyone watching could feel that. But he stood there anyway, in his cut and his gray beard and the friendship bracelet on his wrist. And he told the crowd about a woman with $10 to her name who knelt on frozen concrete for a man everyone else walked past. He said the fund wasn't charity. He said it was a guarantee that the people who give the most won't be the ones who lose everything, that someone would be watching, that someone would catch them. 3 Memphis businesses pledged matching funds on camera. A local news crew captured every word. The fund's first 5 grant recipients were announced. All single parents, all referred through community networks, 2 of them through Miss Ida's church. Miss Ida sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes bright and full, and she did not try to hide it. That evening, everyone made their way to the Stax Music Academy. Zoe had been rehearsing something special, and the spring concert preview was in 2 weeks. But what they would hear in full, 1 year later, nobody was quite prepared for. 1 year later. The Stax Music Academy auditorium held 300 people, and on the night of the spring concert, every seat was filled. Keisha sat in the front row in a blue dress that Sal had picked out at a shop on Broad Avenue, standing beside her in a leather cut and saying, "That one. That's the one," until Keisha laughed and stopped arguing. Iron sat to Keisha's right, large and still and scrubbed clean, the friendship bracelet on his left wrist. Mrs. Coleman sat 2 seats to Keisha's left, in the apartment the foundation had helped her find in Midtown. A good apartment, with heat that worked and a landlord who returned calls. 3 rows back, Miss Ida held her program in her arthritic hands and kept her back perfectly straight. In the aisle, Mr. Gaines sat in a wheelchair pushed by his daughter, who had insisted, firmly and completely, that he would not miss this. He was 90 now, small as paper, and his eyes were clear. Clarence Kendrick stood in the sound booth above the house, looking down through the glass. The house lights dimmed. Zoe Monroe walked out onto the stage. She was 9 years old, the same age Lily Kendrick had been when she died. The narrator doesn't press on that. It doesn't need pressing. It just lands, quietly, and stays. Zoe wore her hair in two neat puffs that Keisha had done that morning, taking extra time, her hands steady and sure. Zoe's light-up sneakers, Marcus's sneakers, the last pair he ever bought her, the ones that no longer lit up, were on her feet. She had refused to wear anything else. She sat down at the grand piano. She adjusted the bench the way Miss Ida had taught her. She looked out at the audience for one moment, and her face was calm. "This is a song I wrote for my mama," she said. "It's called $10. A murmur moved through the house. Then she played. It was a child's melody, simple. Just a few notes at first, finding their shape, and then opening into something fuller. A theme that turned and returned on itself, the way certain truths do, the way love does. There was a gas station in it if you listened. There was a frozen night and a kneeling woman and a granola bar on a stranger's knee. There was a father who was gone and a mother who held the whole world up with her two tired hands and never once let it fall. There was a little girl who had been watching everything, understanding everything, composing it in secret on a church piano at $15 a month, turning her family's pain into something you could hear. Keisha pressed both hands over her mouth. Iron gripped the armrest. His jaw worked. Tears ran down his weathered face without apology, and he didn't wipe them away. Sal, 3 rows back in her leather cut, wept into her hand. Mr. Gaines reached over and found his daughter's hand in the dark and held it. In the sound booth, Clarence Kendrick stood very still with his eyes closed, listening. Somewhere in that melody he could hear Lily, not gone, not lost, but carried forward, living in a new voice, a different child, a different life, the same impossible gift. He nodded once, slowly, to no one. When Zoe finished, the last note held in the air for a long moment. Then the audience rose, all of them, every person in that room, on their feet, without a signal or a cue, just rising the way people rise when something true has entered the room and they need to stand up to receive it. Keisha stood with her hands still over her mouth and tears streaming down her face, and she thought of Marcus, of his voice in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, of the way he used to put his hand on Zoe's head and say, "That's my girl." Of $74,000 in debt he never asked to leave behind, of $10 on a freezing January night, and everything that $10 had become. She had not known she was planting a seed. She thought she was just buying bandages. She thought she was just doing what you do when someone needs help and you happen to be there. She didn't know that one act of kneeling would build a bridge between two broken brothers. She didn't know it would put a dead girl's name on a living scholarship, or fill a room with 500 families lifted out of crisis, or bring an old man in a wheelchair to the front row of his girl's finest moment. She didn't know any of it. That's how it works. The people who change the world never know they're doing it. They're not thinking about legacy or impact or what anyone will say. They're just kneeling on cold concrete because someone needs help, and they have something to give, and giving it is simply who they are. Keisha Monroe had $10. She spent all of it, and the world has never been quite the same since. If this story reminded you that what you give when you have nothing is worth more than what others give from abundance, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe so you never miss a story like Keisha's.